very much for this very welcoming remarks. I barely believe it was me that you're talking about. But anyway, some of this stuff here is the stuff that you use when you apply for, for promotion and all that, and you have to somehow sell yourself, sell the idea that you deserve promotion. So the language is a little bit off the top, but I thank you very much for the very warm welcome remarks. My name is Walcir Cardoso. Please call me Valci by my first name. If you need to talk to me early, so first of all, I'd like to thank you for being here, and also like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to present parts of my research. I'm going to share my screen now so that I can go over some of the slides that I prepared. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, we see your
You all
slides now.
okay as well?
Yeah, the audio is perfect.
Okay, perfect then. Okay, so the title, as Shakira said, is extending the reach of the second language classroom with text-to-speech synthesizers. If you have never heard of synthesizers, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But basically, we're going to be talking about speaking with technology, then assessing text-to-speech synthesis, speech quality, the quality of these, whether the question they're going to be asking is it appropriate for second language teaching? That is the type of input that it provides. Does it qualify as a good input for second language use? And finally, we're going to assess TTS's pedagogical potential. So we're going to focus on a particular aspect of phonology. And the question is, can he help learners learn in this particular environment via the use of text-to-speech synthesis? So before I start, I have to clarify some assumptions here. The first one is that, as you know, my research today, or what I'm going to be talking about today, focuses on pronunciation, and I view the goal of pronunciation teaching as reaching intelligibility. That is, to make one understood by others. Right. So this is pretty much a vague and widely and loosely defined for a term for intelligibility. So intelligibility I view as the ability to be understood by others. Another assumption also is that for the teaching and learning of pronunciation, we have to focus on both segments and supersegmentals. So we follow a communicative approach that covers the accuracy, fluency continuum. And finally, that to acquire or improve a new phonological system in the second language, you need to have access to input, that is the second language, the target second language. You have also to have opportunities for output, that is for producing the language. And very importantly, you also need opportunities for practice. So you have to practice not only input and output. I see this trilogy of factors in a type of mechanism in which the three elements are the interact. Today, we're going to focus on one of those elements or one of those components, which is the input, the part in green. And it's color coded in case you get lost and you want to know what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's talk about some of the issues that happen in pronunciation teaching. One that we know of is that students have limited input, right? Lots of researchers have counted or computed the number of hours you spent in the classroom teaching pronunciation. In fact, just learning English, just being exposed to English. And they found that the quantity is not enough. There is simply not enough time. Also, the quality of the input the students receive is not also appropriate. Okay, there are many ways of this defining quality. For example, it can be that the teacher's accent, for example, is not appropriate for teaching pronunciation. It could be also the variability. I'm talking here about the teacher's accent, not in the sense that it's heavily accented. It's just that in a lot of different countries. I can talk about Brazil, which is the countries that where some of this research took place, is that teachers simply cannot speak English. So this is really what I mean by the teacher's accent in this particular context. And very importantly, that some of the things that you are teaching are not salient, they don't stand out. So how can learners learn something if they cannot hear, if they cannot notice in the input? And a lot of this input also is not learning appropriate, right? We can talk a little bit more about this later if you're interested. Also, the opportunities for output is also limited. possibly because there's not much time in the classroom to develop output skills or such as speaking. And finally, because of time constraints, there are limited practice, right? So we don't have enough time to practice. So once the teacher reaches a threshold or a common goal, he or she moves on to other things because we just cannot spend too much time talking about a specific issue in the second language. And we know that for the development of fluency, practice is very, very important, particularly the automatized type of practice that is important. So if you were to summarize, maybe to put it in another way, I think the main constraint behind these limitations is time. We just don't have enough time. In many schools, students have 2 hours of practice. The lucky ones have 2 hours of exposure to the target language. So one way of addressing these issues that we have been talking so far is by using technology. And today we're going to be talking about one of these technologies, which is text-to-speech synthesis. Some of the advantages that it promotes an environment that is semi-autonomous, in which the teacher, for example, can have some regulation in the process. It can also be fully autonomous, that we usually refer to as in the wild, or it can also serve for strategy development, which we'll talk more about later, but it's merely the ability to teach your students how to fish, how to learn on their own, how to develop strategies to learn beyond the scope of the activity that you are focusing on. So the proposal for computer assisted pronunciation teaching, this is what the CAPT term stands for. I summarize here, which text-to-speech focuses on input and practice. Automatic speech recognition, that we're not going to talk about today, focuses on the output and practice. And finally, there are also opportunities for us to combine these two different technologies, in which combined technologies that promote the practice of input and output. But we're not going to talk about this again. As I mentioned earlier, the focus would be on text-to-speech synthesizers. One of the first questions that we ask when we talk about TTS is whether it is ready for the second language classroom. So there have been some studies in the past that have evaluated whether the quality of this synthesized voice is good enough for the second language classroom, but there hasn't been one for at least 10 years. And we know that the technology has evolved considerably over the past, I would say, over the past 5 years. Right? So we're going to talk about a study in which we evaluated the quality of the voice of a current synthesized voice. Okay, so for those who are not familiar, this is an example of a text-to-speech synthesizer. This is an application installed on a desktop, but there are many, many different ways of accessing text-to-speech. One of them, for example, you can use a mobile phone, you can use a Google Translate. Google also has a TTS feature. So there are many, many different ways. What I'm showing you now is one that you install on your desktop, on your computer, and you have a little bit more flexibility in what you can do. But the main advantage is that you can put in your pocket and use it as a learn anywhere, anytime type of tool. So this is what a TTS does. So first by clicking this button, you can listen and repeat to what the synthesizer is saying. It also highlights the word that is being read. You can also play selected words. You can select words individually and then play it out loud. You can also control the voice, not only male, female, but also the accent, whether it has low pitch or high pitch. Usually, many applications provide you with a lot of different options to play with in terms of variability in the synthesizer. And finally, you can also control the speed, which you can see that is a very interesting way of highlighting, making certain things stand out in the language that you're learning. So I'm going to play here very quickly this particular text that you see on the screen, just for you to have a sense of what it sounds like if you haven't heard this before.
This is a story about a young soldier. He traveled far away from home to fight in a war. He was lonely and missed his family and friends.
So anyway,
One day
let me stop here. So you have an idea about the quality of the sound. This is a voice also that it was released about 5 years ago, so it's slightly outdated. The technology has already evolved, but unfortunately, this is the one I had access to, so I'm using it now. So why TTS, as we talked about, it provides opportunities for an increase in exposure to the target language, right? So you can increase the quantity by, for example, extending the reach of a classroom to an outside environment in which learners can learn on their own, anytime, anywhere. You can also improve the quality in a certain way. As I mentioned to you, you can slow down parts of the target language and potentially notice and learn particular aspect of the language you're being exposed to, and also variety. So as we discussed earlier, you can change not only the voices, adult, child, older people. You can also change male, female, high pitch, low pitch. So you have a wide and also different regional accents of English. So you can be exposed to a lot of different varieties of the target language. And also, it meets most all of the criteria for, in fact, the two of them we don't know yet at this point in the presentation, but it also meets most of the criteria for selecting call or computer assisted pronunciation teaching applications. So it provides learner fit. Learner fit means that the program can be personalized to your own needs. Authenticity, we can talk more about these if you're interested during the discussion period. I don't want to spend too much time discussing each one. The point here is to show that TTS accomplishes or meets most of these criteria. The two ones that are interesting to us is the quality of the speech and whether the application provides explicit language focus, that is, opportunities for learners to emphasize particular parts of the target language in order to learn, in order to make it stand out and potentially learn, right? So this, in fact, constitutes the two research questions of this proposal. That is the quality, what is the quality of this, of a current TTS system? And finally, whether we can focus on particular aspect of the language. I'll talk more about this later, but let's see now what people have said about text-to-speech synthesis and second language acquisition. As you can see here, I don't really say that, but it has shown very positive results in terms of learning to write, improving one's vocabulary and reading skills, also improving one's pronunciation. There have been a few studies over the past couple, 2 decades on using text-to-speech to improve pronunciation. But there's still very few evaluations of TTS systems, which is what we're doing here. Like how good how good is the quality of the input of the language that is given to students, for example. And this is one of the things that we're going to be doing today. The evaluation for TTS use in CALL has focused on comparing text-to-speech and humans, right? So basically, there have been 2 general criteria: human rating, in which humans evaluate the voice of a human in comparison with a TTS in terms of naturalness. That's an obvious one. Accuracy, how accurate it is to this potential target, which can be a native speaker or a fluent speaker, depending on how you see the world. Comprehensibility, which is how much you think you can understand the language. So these are we usually use assessors or judges to rate. And finally, there are also tests that involve cognitive processing, is how much time it takes for you to process, whether you can understand the speech or not. So let's focus now on human rating. As you can see here, in terms of human rating, regarding those criteria that I talked about: accuracy, naturalness, intelligibility, acceptability. What we can see here in this chart is that it seems that things are improving. For example, if you look at Nussbaum 1995, human did much better than TTS. And if you compare with a study from 2009, which is a more recent one that has evaluated TTS and that has compared TTS to humans, we can see that humans are, regarding those 2 criteria, humans are comparable, or they behave relatively the same. If you look at cognitive skills such as comprehension, speech shadowing, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, and reaction time, that is, when you listen, for example, when you listen to a synthesized voice and then you ask to repeat, how long does it take for you to process what you heard and repeat it? So these are some of the things that people have investigated from a cognitive perspective, usually comparing TTS to a human voice, right? And as you can see here, it seems to be stable. There is not really a consensus about how humans and TTS compare with regards to cognition. So just to summarize some of the things we've discussed so far, we have found mixed results for the quality of synthesized speech versus human speech. Some of these studies are relatively dated. The more recent one is from 2009, before this one that we're talking about today. They have mixed evaluation methods across studies. I don't know if you noticed, but some of them deal with reaction time, while others need deal with accuracy and so forth. And we're not aware of any study that has looked at TTS for its potential for focus on specific language features. In this study, for this particular study, we're going to evaluate TTS potential to identify past tense morphology. That is the word final, the endings for past tense marking, such as walked, played, and visited, right? So we're gonna talk about this in a few minutes. So the two main research questions for this project are, is there a difference in the quality of speech produced by TTS in comparison with that by humans for a variety of tasks? I'm going to talk about this task in a few minutes. And can TTS offer the opportunity to focus on linguistic form? As I mentioned, the focus would be on past D and its allomorphs that I just described. That is the ending as in walked, played, and visited. So those three forms, right? The hypothesis you have there for the first question is that there will not be any difference because of recent developments in TTS technology. And for the second one, I think yes. I mean, it was hypothesized that the answer would be yes for the second question because of those features that I just talked about. You can slow down the speed, for example. You can repeat, which humans are not necessarily good for, right? Okay, so the participants for this study for evaluating TTS in humans were 47 English as a foreign language students in Belém, Brazil. You have a breakdown of the proficiency of the age difference. What is really important is the design of the material. So whatever we created for humans, we're also created for TTS, right? I have here an example. I realized later that the quality is not great, but I'm going to play it anyway. So we recorded a set of short stories, sentences, and phrases using TTS, and then we hired a graduate student who's also an ESL teacher to record the same text. So what we did, whatever we did for TTS, we also did for humans. So we're comparing both in a number of criteria that we're going to talk about later. So this is an example of what the TTS sounds like in one sentence.
I invited him to dinner.
And this is what a human sounds like.
I invited him to dinner.
Well, it's a little louder for this one here, sorry. All right. Okay, so basically, these are the things we're going to do today. These are the tasks that the participants were asked to participate in. So the first one was a story comprehension. They would listen to a story and then perform on those criteria that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Then they listen to story and sentences, and then they had to rate according to comprehensibility, naturalness, and so forth. There is also a task that we call a story repetition, which is known as shadowing, in which they will listen to the text and then repeat it right afterwards as they were listening. And finally, feature identification task. We're going to talk about each of these 5 tasks in the next few slides. We also, at the end, we conduct a semi-structured interview, but we're not going to talk about the interview in this presentation. We're going to focus on the quality of TTS. So for the first task, they would listen to a story such as, I'm going to play just a little, the first few sentences. This is the TTS speaking.
The nasty parrot. Last Christmas, Jimmy received the best present. It was a parrot.
The nasty
Not a
parrot.
human.
Last Christmas, Jimmy received the best present. It was a parrot.
Anyway, so after this, they were asked to rate how easy it was to understand. This is really a different way of asking for comprehensibility. This is really how the construct is usually operationalized. So how easy it was to understand what you just heard. Another one was naturalness, how natural it was, the speech, and how correct, how accurate the speech was in comparison with this, fluent or native speaker, whatever you see as the possessor of this accuracy for the target language. So this is a little bit, in fact, the third criteria just added there just for the sake of it, because people talk about correctness also when they focus. Some studies that deal with second language pronunciation, learning, and teaching, they also tend to focus on accuracy, and they decided to include something related to it, but we're not really that interested in accuracy. As I mentioned earlier, we see pronunciation teaching as a teaching of skills that improve intelligibility, not accuracy. But for comparison purposes, we decided to include that factor. So we also asked the same participants to rate also sentences, not stories, but sentences in terms of comprehensibility, naturalness, and correctness. We also asked them to perform a shadowing activity. So a shadowing activity, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but you listen to the text or to speech, and then you have to repeat as you are listening to it. Right? So you listen to the story and at the same time, you try to repeat it. This is an activity that we refer to as shadowing. And there have been many, many studies I have looked at this as a tool to tap into people's cognitive skills. The assumption is that the faster you process the language, the faster the reaction time. So the faster you're able to repeat, the faster, no, the better from a cognitive perspective that task or that text is. In this case, you're going to be comparing TTS and humans. So the assumption is that if one is harder to process, it will take you longer to repeat, right? And also, we also looked at accuracy, the accuracy of what you repeated, how accurate it was from the original form. And finally, there was a feature identification task, which we merely asked the students to listen to a sentence such as,
I invited him to dinner.
and then they would first ask whether there was in the past or present, and then finally they would listen to the word again and then decide which form of the ed, which allomorph of the ed they heard, whether it was t, d, or ud. I'm going to play now a human saying the same thing.
I invited him to dinner.
Okay, so again, the participant would have to say whether they heard it in the past or not past. And if they heard it in the past, they had to identify which form of the past they heard, if it was t, d, or ed. So this ends the 5 tasks that we use to evaluate the quality of TTS. Now we're switching to the results. So let's start with story comprehension. For story comprehension, we observe no difference between the two. You can see the human bar is slightly higher, but in fact, that difference was not significant, as you can see by the p-values there. So there's no statistical significance between TTS and human in terms of story comprehension. That is, the participants were able to understand the stories read by humans and TTS equally. Regarding story and sentence reading, now we're talking about human rating. These are humans who listened to the forms and they had to rate them in terms of comprehensibility, naturalness, and accuracy or correctness, right? So as you can see here, in terms of comprehensibility, there is no difference. They behave exactly the same. That is, they think that they understood the 2 types of speech equally. However, in terms of naturalness and accuracy, we found significant difference between the 2 groups, indicating that human voices are perceived to be more natural and more accurate than text-to-speech voices, the synthesized voices, which is not unpredictable based on the robotic nature that some of these voices, particularly this one, has. On the rating of sentences, they listen to sentences and also rated the same, using the same criteria. We can see that there is no difference regarding comprehensibility, but we did observe differences in naturalness and accuracy. This is in fact exactly what we observed for short story. We thought that in sentence reading, the TTS would perform relatively equally to a human because those issues related to prosody, stress would be somehow mitigated in shorter sentences. But this is not really what we observed. We observed that the same pattern happened in the rating of sentences. And regarding story repetition, the shadowing, we found that regarding accuracy, or in fact, to make things easier, because there were more incorrect words than correct words, we decided to count inaccuracy. This is why the in is between parentheses there. So there was no statistical difference between, there was no difference between the two, the TTS and the human. As you can see here, they both behave the same way in terms of inaccuracy. Regarding latency, which is the time it takes for the person to repeat each word, we also noticed that there was no significant difference between the two, indicating that TTS and humans behave the same way in terms of how long it took them to process and repeat what they just heard. Okay, and finally, the feature identification task, which was how much they could hear whether the sentence was in the present or past, and how they're able to identify the forms. So as you can see here, there was no statistically significant difference between TTS and humans. They behave exactly the same way regarding to determine whether what they heard was in the past or not past. And finally, regarding the ED allomorphs, those t, d, and ud that characterize the allomorphy of past tense marking, we also noticed that there is no significant difference between the two voices. TTS and human behave exactly the same way. We can see here that TTS is almost reaching significance. The p-value is 0.06. And you can also see that the bar there is slightly higher, which is interesting because this is in fact one of the affordances of text-to-speech in which you can slow the speech. Anyway, we'll talk more about this later. So to summarize, humans did better than TTS in at least two criteria, which was naturalness and accuracy. In other words, humans are better than TTS in terms of naturalness and accuracy. They sound more natural and they sound more accurate. However, regarding TTS and human were comparable in all of the other factors that were included in this investigation. For example, in text comprehension, intelligibility, no difference. In speech rating category, they considered comprehensibility, also no difference. In the cognitive task involving shadowing, also no difference. And more importantly, in past identification, in past tense identification, there was no difference as well in indicating whether it was in the past or not, and also in selecting the form that they heard. So these are very, very interesting results, particularly because the ones in which the humans and TTS are comparable are the ones in which I believe pronunciation teaching or the focus of pronunciation instruction should be, which is on reaching intelligibility in the target language. So to review the research questions, is there a difference? We observed that it's task dependent, right? Because in those two tasks, naturalness and accuracy, the human voice did better than the TTS. And can TTS offer the opportunity to focus on linguistic form? The findings suggest that yes, humans and TTS were equal in their ability to highlight some features that students were learning during the task. So just to compare these findings to previous research to close the circle, we found that in the cognitive measures such as text comprehension, it corroborates previous research that also found that TTS and text and human voices behave in a relatively similar way. In shadowing, however, we saw an improvement from previous research. In previous research, TTS, human tend to be favored, tend to perform better in terms of accuracy and response latency than this study. And in human ratings as well, in comprehensibility, also that corroborates previous research in which, particularly those that have been conducted more recently, in which comprehensibility was deemed the same, whether depending on whether you heard from TTS or by a human. For feature identification, we can compare with previous literature because, as I mentioned earlier, as was indicated in one of the slides, there hasn't been really a study that has looked at this for investigating the quality of text-to-speech. But we have already found positive results in pronunciation studies, which really means that there is something there in order to highlight and make certain things for the input to stand out. It's also possible that this is because the TTS output is invariable, consistent. I mean invariable between quotation marks, because invariable, I'm not referring to variable input in terms of accents, in terms of pitches. I'm talking about issues such as assimilation, deletion, and connected speech phenomena. Those are consistently used regardless of whether you use a child or an adult, whether you use a male or female voice. So that's probably due to this consistency in the input. Regarding the humor ratings, also, again, we observe very similar patterns to what has been observed over the past 2+ decades. Despite these differences in those two, particularly those criteria, we do believe that TTS is good for, particularly in the context of this study, for focus or noticing activities, which is going to be the topic of the second part of the presentation. And it satisfies those criteria that I talked about earlier for selecting and choosing call applications. For example, we can see that the quality of speech, which is the first research question, we were able to find out that the quality is pretty decent. I would say it's of very good quality. And in considering the criteria that I considered important for second language learning and teaching, I think that it did a very good job. The same applies to explicit language focus. Again, we found that the two, TTS and human voices, are comparable in that respect. So what are the pedagogical implications or applications of these findings? As I mentioned in the outset of this presentation, we see it as a complement or an extension of the classroom. For example, the teacher would be talking about past tense in the classroom, but they know that past tense takes a long time to learn, right? So they would ask the students to engage in different types of activities in which those features would be highlighted, would be practiced. Right? For example, they would listen to similar text, they would listen, and they would type to, and they would be asked to categorize the words based on what they heard, and then maybe come up with their own rules based on a kind of a detective work in which they have to find out what the rules are for what they hear. And then in class, the teacher should use the time that they have more efficiently and focus on communicative tasks, or personalized instruction, also provide explicit and individualized feedback. So, in a way, the teacher will be saving time, classroom time. It could be focusing on different things. So to answer the general question of this project, is CTS ready for the second language classroom? I would say that yes, in terms of quality, yes, it is comparable to a human voice in many, many, many important criteria. And secondly, students are able to notice things that are in the input in both TTS and human voices. Okay, so some of the things that we should be doing is using TTS in an actual language classroom as an extension. In fact, this is one of the topics of the second part of this presentation. We should also be comparing. In this study, we compare TTS to a native speaker, but it'll be very interesting to use a non-native teacher, especially in a second or in a foreign language context, right? And see whether the differences would change. Also, very importantly, we need to look at proficiency. We also need to consider other second languages. And also different types of focus on form as well. In this study, I mean, we're going to talk about past TD in a few minutes, but in this study, we focus on one particular feature, which was past TD, but would the same hold for other types of phonological features that require attention from students? Anyway, there are many future directions. We can talk about this later if you're interested. So now we're switching. So now that we have established that TTS provides good quality input, so the next question is, can it contribute to learning? This is pretty much what we're going to be addressing the second part of this presentation. So we're going to be talking about learning second language pronunciation with a text-to-speech synthesizers. So now we're going to apply this synthesized tool to a language environment and see whether it will lead to improvement in pronunciation. Again, as I mentioned to you, the focus will be on past ED marking. So just to refresh the memory of those who are now aware of this or have learned this a long time ago, we know that past D in English is formed by 3 different allomorphs, right? So it takes the t sound if the preceding consonant is voiceless. It is pronounced as id if the preceding consonant is either a T or a D, and it is pronounced d elsewhere, right? So it's rule-based. It's pretty straightforward, and so, but it needs to be taught, and it requires practice, not only of perception, but also in production. Okay, so now we're going to be talking for why passivity. Believe it or not, it sounds like it's simple, it's straightforward, but it's highly complicated to grasp, to produce and perceive these forms. Some of the study that I conducted with some colleagues a while ago, we determined that the reason why passivity is so difficult is because it's not frequent enough. For example, we looked at a teacher corpus of student-directed speech, and we found that only 2% of finite verbs were consisted of passive forms, regular passive forms. Also, the quality, when those forms did occur, they usually occurred in phonological environments that made them transparent or opaque. That means the listeners or students cannot hear them. For example, I walk the dog. In that particular case, you cannot hear the D simply because it is being assimilated or even deleted because of the presence of the following segment, right? And we also, so the pedagogical implication of this study was that we need to increase the frequency of those forms in order for them to be noticed, and also make them more perceptible. That is, increase the quantity, increase exposure, and improve access to the forms via noticing activities, for example. We know that one of the main reasons why passivity is complicated is a lot of the time, I mean, most of the time, is because of L1 influence, particularly in early stages of the process, right? And as you know, many languages do not like those clusters of consonants word finally, such as walked, right? So it is a lot easier for you to say walked with a form, right? So this is one type of L1 transfer. In this particular case here, there have been many studies that have tried to find out why it is so difficult. There are lots of different reasons. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you. I made this list here just to convey the idea that learning past tense is not an easy feat, right? And there are many factors that could affect the acquisition of passivity. What really matters is also a very important reason for why passivity is difficult is because there is not a clear-cut correspondence between what people read and what people pronounce, right? Shakespeare, for example, used at least 3 different strategies to convey that idea. For example, you have in the first one, she loved her, in which he uses apostrophe D, and wedded, in which is the regular form that we see in contemporary, in current English, and then kissed, in which, again, you have apostrophe T. And we know that phoneme to grapheme mismatches affect L2 learning. And finally, another main reason why passivity is so complicated is that in this particular context, English is taught as a foreign language, which means that there's very little access to English outside of the classroom environment. Also, there is the classroom time that we talked a little bit about, and the quality of the input, right? Particularly because some of these teachers are not really, qualified not qualified, but they have low proficiency in oral English. They know a lot about reading, writing, and grammar, but sometimes the oral English is not a par with the students' needs. So one alternative to address some of these limitations is text-to-speech, as I mentioned earlier. It can increase the quantity and improve the quality of the input, as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes. It highlights the text as being read, also increases exposure to English that can happen outside of the classroom environment, and it is consistently intelligible, right? I call it an accented input because it's accented in terms of being a synthesizer, being robotic, but it is consistent what you hear. And it also promotes learner autonomy, increases input variability, and so forth. So this is the tool that we're going to use for the teaching and learning of past 2D. This you have already seen, right? The reason why text-to-speech are important and why they serve to enhance some aspects of the input. For example, learners could repeat parts of or the key words that they want to re-listen and listen to them as many times as they want. Also, the words are being highlighted as it's being read. I'm not going to
This
play the video now, so I'm going to go back again to TTS and second language acquisition. As I mentioned to you earlier, it has been, we have found positive results in terms of teaching ESL skills in writing, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And we know that most of the time it has positive effects on learning. And we're not aware of any study that has looked at the morphophonemics of PAST-TD and in using TTS as an input enhancer. That is, a technology that makes certain aspects of the input stand out. And this is how we're going to use in this study. Before I talk about the goals of the study, a very important assumption by using text-to-speech, because see, we're talking about production, right? Producing those sounds. But in fact, the focus of TTS is on developing perception skills, right? So it's in exposing learners to the input of the second language, right? So the most important assumption here is that perception precedes production. That is, in order to produce, you have to be able, learners need to be able to perceive the forms. And we also assuming that perceptual learning transfer to SP to L2 speech perception. That is, if learners learn how to perceive a sound, they will eventually be able to produce it. So this is a very, very, very risky hypothesis that we're making here in the study, but it is the one that we contemplated when we designed the study. So the main goal of this study is to explore TTS as a tool to enhance in quantity and quality the oral input to which ESL learners are exposed. And again, as I mentioned to you earlier, the focus is on PAST-TD marking. And the research question is a very simple one. How is it an effective tool for teaching, for the learning of L2 pronunciation, particularly PAST-TD? So this is a yes or no research question. In order to answer this question, we recruited 49 participants. Unfortunately, due to many constraints, we can talk about this later, we ended up with only 18 participants, 9 of each. Luckily, at least we can make more interesting comparisons. But I can talk about the reasons why this happened, but we ended up with less than 50% of the participants. But they were divided into 2 groups. So 9 participants were in the group that had access to text-to-speech synthesis to learn PAST-TD marking, while the other one was taught by a fluent speaker of English. In fact, yours truly. And I know how to pronounce PAST-TD in English, I hope. Anyway, so they were divided into these 2 groups, and basically they did exactly the same thing, with the only difference that the group that used TTS work on their own. They worked usually in the lab. This language school had a lab, and they usually work there in the lab, and they're asked to spend at least 4.5 hours in the 6 activities over a period of almost a month. So the same thing happened with the non-TTS group, except in the non-TTS, the NTTS group had a teacher as instructor. So the feedback was provided by the teacher. So the teacher read out loud those stories. The teacher asked them to, if they asked the teacher to repeat, the teacher would also repeat, and so forth. So the feedback was given by yours truly, the instructor. The pre-test and post-test were relatively simple. The first one consisted of reading aloud a list of words that also contained some distractors. For example, house, but helped, passed, smiled, and so forth. They also had another task, which you call spontaneous. Don't forget that these are second language, foreign language speakers of English. So we cannot have fully spontaneous tasks. So they asked also because we wanted to get a certain amount of target tokens. So we asked them to engage in a guided or task. So they had a role play in which they talked about Lena, this girl in the picture that you can see. She just took a vacation in Japan. And there were questions about what she did. So the question was, for example, did she arrive safely? And based on the check mark on the sheet that the participants had, they had to answer either yes or no providing the full sentence so that the target past form would be produced. You have some examples there on the slide. This is just a breakdown of this is not really interested of how, these are highly frequent words in English that we're very careful in selecting the words so that place of articulation and manner of articulation were controlled in the selection and design of these words. You take my word for it because we're not going to have the time to dissect each of these places and manners of articulation. And at the end, I had an oral interview in which we asked about their perceptions of using the technology as a learning tool. In the particular context of the teacher, we asked them about the experience, the learning experience. So we have here some of the detail of this oral interview. The treatment consisted of 4 different tasks that they had to do. So they had to listen to a story 2 times, a story that was given to them. I mean, the non-TTS group was read by a teacher. Then they had to answer a set of questions based on comprehension. So they had a comprehension set of questions, for example, what happened afterwards, or they had to describe. Same thing for the non-TTS group. They also had a fill in the blank activity, and finally a listen and categorize. I'm going to show each one of these activities in a bit. What is very important is that the only difference between the 2 scenarios or the 2 environments or the 2 groups was that one used TTS only while the other one used a teacher only. And the whole thing lasted approximately 4.5 hours. They were asked to do each activity in about 45 minutes. I had a bit of control on the group that I taught, but unfortunately I could not really control for those who used TTS. But it's not really important, as you'll see in a few minutes. So this is the listening activity. So they would listen to it and they would have some comprehension questions just to encourage them to listen to the text and notice certain forms. Then they had a fill in the blank. These blanks consisted of past TT forms. There were some distractors as well. Then they had to listen to a set of words and categorize them based on what they heard. This is really to intuitively for them to develop their phonological awareness to the different forms. And we coded all this data. I won't go into the detail of the coding and analysis, but we use mix within subject analysis or variance, which was followed by pairwise comparisons when appropriate. But as you see, our analysis was relatively simple, our statistical analysis. So I'll switch now to the red color, which is the results part. So on the word reading task, as you can see, there was no effect for time or group, and all allomorphs remain the same. This all means that I'm not going to bore you with the word reading task because the participants behave pretty much the same way. However, in the guided task, there was no effect for group, meaning that the 2 groups behaved the same way, so we combined them into one group. And there was interaction between time and allomorph, which means that there was some improvement for allomorph, for the past TT mark over time, which is what we're going to talk about now. Right? These are the interesting results. So as you can see here, these are the results for the pre-test. There was no difference between T and D. As you can see, there is a lot of id form, which is natural because they transfer from the L1, but also because of orthography, right? However, if you look at the results of the post-test, we can see that no significance between the D and T allomorphs changed, right? So we can see now that there is a hierarchy in which id is acquired before D, which is acquired before T, right? So you can see here that after this training, the participants were able, this is pretty much what it is showing, that they're able to learn to improve on their performance of the D sound, right? It doesn't sound like a lot, but I think it's very interesting that the 2 groups behave the same way. So that really shows us how difficult learning past tense marking is. Okay, what is also interesting, this is now really looked at statistically, was that the TTS group decreased, they decreased in the amount of id form, which is a good, right? That means that they have realized that the id form, that the id allomorph is not as it doesn't happen everywhere. So they knew that they had to reduce it, and there was a very interesting reduction in the production of the id form. So the general discussion, I mean, the first research question, the only research question we had is TTS an effective tool for learning to pronunciation? These results indicate that yes, particularly because the TTS behave in a very similar way to a group that was taught by a regular ESL teacher. But very interestingly, in these findings is that learners also became more aware of the ED alternation. And you can find this in some of the quotes that the participants gave us. For example, some letters don't belong to the word, like the ED in the past. Or the last one is what I like, because the person didn't quite get the rule, but at least the person developed the awareness that there was something different. It has a little sound of T at the end in some words. So this person realized, that the id, as they used to pronounce, is not the right way. There is something different. They have to pronounce the T at the end of certain words, for example. So this we can see that the awareness increased. One of the features that we think, affected these results is the fact that there was no focus on production, right? As you know, this study was fully focused on the development of perception or exposure to the input. And we think that if we included a production component, which is usually the case in the classroom, right? If you combine this, for example, with production practice, we would probably observe better results. We also acknowledge that it's possible that this new acquired knowledge is still in the realm of perception. Because see, this is again what I assumed earlier. We assumed in this project that by focusing on input exposure, learners would be able to transfer their knowledge into production, right? Which is really a huge and very interesting and risky assumption. It's possible that this knowledge was not enough to transfer to production over this 4.5 hours of training. It's possible that it needed something else to trigger the phenomena in order to be transferred to production. It is also, as I mentioned earlier, that if you combine this type of implicit learning with explicit learning, with explicit teaching, this learning process will be faster, which really would be probably more ecologically valid, because this is what happens in the classroom, right? In the classroom, we don't always learn things intuitively or implicitly. There is also, we need some kind of explicit teaching and learning. And I would also say that, yes, teachers should still bother with TTS. As you see, the participants overwhelmingly enjoy the experience, as you can see in the quote that I have on the slide. And also they believed, at least almost 50% of the participants also in the TTS group stated that they think that improved their pronunciation. And you can see some of the quotes here. What is very interesting, the last one, that we learn how to pronounce words like parachutes, which is really an example of this strategy development idea that the role of the purpose of this study was to focus on past TD, how to pronounce it, but students are able to use the same tool to learn about the pronunciation of other words, such as parachutes. Right? So in practice, we would recommend TTS as to complement a teacher's class. For example, at home, the teacher could be at home outside of the classroom environment. The students could do TTS-based activities and practice very similar to the ones we described earlier. And in class, the teacher to use, the time that is reserved for teaching, the teacher could use that time more effectively, more efficiently by pushing output or practice, for example, talking about past event, engaging students in more communicative tasks, also personalize and provide explicit feedback, which is a problem in this study, that there was no way of providing implicit feedback. So for example, in terms of some of the criteria that we use in this study, regarding orthography, focus on those target sounds such as d, t, that do not have a clear match with orthography, right? Because the forms that are spelled with the D are easily learned because it's merely a question of transferring their already existing knowledge. We also noticed that in the read aloud, there was no difference. We only observed this difference in the more spontaneous task in which they are asked to engage in a conversation with a researcher. And also we should focus on the form that is most difficult to acquire, which is the t form, which is really acquired later. So to conclude, the goal was to explore TTS as a tool for teaching and learning past tense marking, and it found that TTS behaved relatively the same regarding the acquisition of past TT marking. You might think that this is kind of disappointing, but it's not. Don't forget that we're comparing TTS, in which learners were able to learn on their own without any interference from a human, in comparison with a teacher who had to stay with the students for 4 or 5 hours in the classroom. So they pretty much reached the same level of performance regarding past TD. A very important point I want to make is that I'm not saying that TTS could be replacing the teacher as a provider of input. This is not at all. What I'm really suggesting here is that teachers could use their time in the classroom more efficiently, more effectively, and focus on things that are more appropriate for that environment, that can be learned more quickly, or that require human intervention, such as providing feedback, such as personalizing the learning process. So we also found that TTS can be used as a complement to second language classes because it can address those 3 issues that I mentioned at the very beginning. It can increase and improve the target L2. It can help develop better grapheme to phoneme associations. As we know, there's a discrepancy between orthography and pronunciation. And finally, to address some of the time constraints that affect many L2 learning environments by extending the reach of the classroom to this to an anytime, anywhere type of learning outside of the classroom. So this is all I had to share with you. Thank you very much.